Thank you all so much for joining us today for this virtual conversation with Professor Frank Wilderson. My name is Kylie de Rosario, and I'm an ambassador for the Dartmouth Political Union. For those of you who may not know, the Dartmouth Political Union is a nonpartisan student-run organization dedicated to providing a forum for respectful political discourse on Dartmouth's campus. We offer a platform for officials, academics, politicians, and other professionals of all backgrounds and political affiliations to present their ideas. The DPU makes a point, however, to never endorse its speakers. We will be taking live questions during the latter part of this event, so if you would like to ask a question to Professor Wilderson, please type it into the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. And remember to upvote your favorite questions. If you are not comfortable asking your question live, please submit it anonymously. I would now like to welcome Professor Frank Wilderson, dramatist, critic, Chancellor's Professor of African American Studies Department at UC Irvine, an award-winning author of works including Afropessimism and Red, White, and Black, Cinema and the Structure of U.S. Antagonisms. He spent 5.5 years in South Africa, where he was one of 2 Americans to hold elected office in the African National Congress during the apartheid era and was a cadre in the underground. He graduated from Dartmouth College in 1978 and received his MFA in Fiction Creative Writing from Columbia University and PhD in the Rhetoric Department Film Studies program at UC Berkeley. Professor, thank you for joining us today. I would also like to introduce our moderator for this event, History Professor Naaborko Sackeyfio-Lenoch, who teaches courses on pre-colonial and modern African history here at Dartmouth. Thank you for joining us today. Professor, on to you.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much for this wonderful opportunity to engage with Professor Wilderson. I think I'll start us off, by saying welcome, and I really look forward to an engaged conversation on what I would say is probably a very controversial, on some levels, concept and theory, right? This Afropessimism discourse that we'll be discussing today. So I'd like to start off actually with a 2-part question and ask Frank. We talked about going by our first name, so we'll be a bit informal here. So I'd like to begin with a 2-part question and ask you to first situate yourself historically and share with us what it meant to be a Black student at Dartmouth during the momentous sort of civil rights and Black power era of the 1960s and 70s that in turn intersected with decolonization on the African continent and the fashioning of newly independent African states. So that's the first part, is to kind of give us that backdrop. And then the second part of the question is for you to please share with us how the historical moment informed your intellectual and personal engagement with Afro-pessimist thought as both a discourse on contemporary Black diaspora realities. And if you could, in that answer, please give us your definition about what Afro-pessimism means to you. So I hope that makes sense.
Yes, Naaborko, great to see you again. It's been a couple of years or so, huh? Maybe you could help me a little bit by honing. Those are 2 very good questions, very big. In the first part of the first section of your 2-part question, what part of that is most animating for you? Maybe I could kind of start there.
Yes. Wonderful. Right. So I'll just sort of note that I'd like for you to actually talk about the second part, which is sort of how your historical background, both as a student at this institution and in general, how did that inform your intellectual and personal engagement with Afro-pessimist thought as a discourse on contemporary Black diaspora realities? So if you can talk about how your personal journey kind of intersected with the formation of your ideas around Afro-pessimist thought over time.
Okay, and if you do me one last favor, is tell me if I'm talking too long on one question, because we do want to move it along, and I can drill down and get into the weeds. But let me just say that I just have to be honest. As I said to all of you as we were kind of setting up for the tech for the first 15 minutes before we started, my relationship to Dartmouth intellectually and emotionally is one of ambiguity. It's not one of great celebration, but it's not what it was actually in the 1970s. When I attended from 74 to 78, I was kicked out, given the second harshest sentence for political activism that you could get, which would be an indefinite suspension, when I had 3 classes left to graduate. And I came back in 1980 and did 2 quarters at Dartmouth. My dream was to go to UC Berkeley, which I applied to as an out-of-state student and did not get in. They had Ivy League standards for out-of-state students. But I was, so I think that coming to an institution that had really just in the past like 3 to 4 years started since like 69, a program of integration. I mean, I think that's something in 1967, the program that you and I did together several years ago at Dartmouth, one of the alumni said there was only 37 people were Black at Dartmouth prior to this period. And so they increased that, tenfold. And I felt that Dartmouth then, and probably Dartmouth now, I would say probably to leave some space to be wrong, was not ready to be changed by Black presence. They were actually imposing upon us a sense that we should be grateful for being there and get with the esprit de corps of Dartmouth as opposed to dealing with the essence of where we came from. So I went to a high school that was half of it was run by teachers who were like white working class, old school teachers, and the other half, because it was an experimental school, were run by people of the new left. And I came to Dartmouth with notions and ideas and desires to learn about the world so that I could change it essentially. Not to help it reform from what it is, but I came to Dartmouth as a bona fide dyed-in-the-wool Marxist dedicated to revolution. And I found that very few people on the faculty were open to that. There were a few people that I gleaned onto that helped me a lot. Diane Pender-Hughes, who's now a political scientist at Notre Dame, and Bill Cook. But I had to struggle against the esprit de corps of Dartmouth College and to continuously tell myself that I'm in it, but not of it. And that actually was a very depressing kind of experience because in other parts of the world, say at Columbia and at Berkeley and on either coast, the academic scenarios or contexts were such that they were allowing you to engage in questions of not how to be a good citizen, but how to interrogate the right of a country to exist, the right of capitalism to exist. And I think towards the end, if I look back now at the age of 65, to come full circle and hopefully answer your question, I was not an Afro-pessimist then. I was a, historical materialist. And my minor was philosophy, and that was basically existentialist courses. I had one professor who read a manuscript from a person who no one knew, and it had not been translated into English, called Discipline and Punish by Michel Foucault. And those were some of the highlights of my time there, in addition to sports, playing football. But having to hone my intellectual skills, having to hone my intellectual agenda, having to work my questions against the very esprit de corps of the institution was going to either make or break me. And I saw it break a lot of people in the AM, what was officially called Cutter Hall back in the day. But it made me in the sense that I never kind of gave into the reason for being of Dartmouth itself. And I got the great academic skills that they produce and give to you. And I realized that the big philosophical questions that revolutionaries were asking themselves around the world could not be engaged here. And I found ways to do it on my own. So rein me in if there's some aspect that you'd like me to address that I haven't in my rambling here, please, because I don't want to go on without
No, that's been helpful, just giving some context to your time here. And I'm actually, a bit of bias on my end, interested in you talking a bit about your time to move on and to transition to another question, is to move on and talk with us and our larger audience about some of the watershed moments in the evolution of your thinking on Afropessimism through the context of your experiences in Africa, on the African continent, and particularly in South Africa, where you spent quite a bit of time. So I think it would be very useful to center this discussion around your time in the wider diaspora on the continent, and of course share with us your definition and on what Afropessimist thought means to you, because I imagine there might be many audience members who are not familiar with the framework, with the theorizing of what it means, how it's evolved. So in your answer to that question on your time and on the continent, please share with us your in a succinct way as possible your definition. How are you using this term Afropessimism in your work and in your thinking more broadly?
Okay, I will say one little footnote about going back to the Dartmouth question, if I might, for a second.
Sure. Yes.
A couple of things happened to me that were painful, and while I was an undergraduate student at Dartmouth, but I couldn't really translate them. And Afropessimism has helped me think through why my intuition about these experiences were true to an Afropessimist philosophical outlook, even though they didn't work with the existential philosophical outlook that I officially had and the Marxist outlook that I had. One was that I was heavily engaged with a professor called Menza in the philosophy department. And he had a clique of groupies around him, but he was a brilliant guy. And I felt like these were a group of white people that I could, undergraduates and Menza himself, I could share anything with. And I began one day in one of our discussion groups talking about the way in which we in the AM, what they call Cutter Hall, would always say, the good thing about Dartmouth is that I will know how to deal with any kind of racism after I get out of this MF, because nothing will be as hard as this, okay? And I was sharing that with them, and they immediately vamped. These are my comrades in Revolutionary Arms. They vamped from this, like, you can't boil this down to race, Frank. You need to think of it in different rubrics, And it's not the words itself, it's that energy that I will experience over and over again in political groups of shutting down the voice of Black suffering when it seeks to articulate something that is different than the other voices of other subaltern sufferers. That was one thing. The other thing was when I became chairperson of the Afro-American Society, the school year 1975 to 76, one of the deans took me out to Hanover Inn to lunch and said, we're giving you $25,000 for this organization. Now that's called a BSU, a Black Student Union, at the University of Minnesota, other places. And he says, and he begins to not ask me questions about what is, I got elected on a highly, highly intense political ticket. There was a highly intense political debate about revolution reform that happened in the basement of Cutter Hall that elected me. And so I had an agenda. And he began to say to me, you can do anything that you want with this money, but we would prefer if they were cultural and musical events as opposed to political events. And I want you to take that preference very seriously. He was basically telling me, it was highly paternalistic. And that really turned me off. So the first thing I did with the money was to go to the United Nations and pay for the delegation from SWAPO in Namibia to come up to campus to speak. And the second thing I did was to hire a bunch of buses to bring people down to UMass, where there was a regional Black Student Union conference going on revolution. The final thing was when I got kicked out and came back, for some odd reason, I was back for 2 quarters, and I was elected to the Board of Trustees as a student representative. And the Dartmouth Review was just being started. So they came to me and they said, you can do your own page. We want to be open politically to everything. I said, you're a bunch of right-wing, And they said, no. We want you on the editorial board. Do your page. You're a prominent person on campus. And I became a page editor at the Dartmouth Review. And I had my own page, which was on Fanon. It was on the revolution in South Africa, in Zimbabwe. It was on all sorts of things. And the day that it came out, they took the whole page out. They did not put it in the newspaper. They kept my name on the masthead. And they had a black tie affair at the Hanover Inn where the editors, William F. Buckley, and other conservative editors from the National Review, who were helping to finance the first issue, came to have a black tie reception for all the editors of the Dartmouth Review. And security had noticed to bar me from that because I was going to go and give them a piece of my mind. So those particular things, the affective nature in which Blackness is crowded out spontaneously by the left, the right, and the middle helped shape my thinking later on. In South Africa, let me hit it back to you so that I go more specifically targeted to your question. You wanted me to talk about my time in relation to Afropessimism, or can you say it again?
Right. So, well, thank you. Let me back up and say thank you very much for connecting some of your experiences as a Black man on campus and the work that you did in the various organizations concerned with Black life on this campus, as well as some of the political awakening and experiences that you had. We see, I think you did a very nice job of connecting that then to Africa. So I'm going to come back to that piece here then. And so thanks for that backdrop. Now, I'm interested in you sharing with us some of your experiences in South Africa, living and working there, particularly in terms of your work with the ANC and some of the other underground sort of, political efforts that were underway at the height of the apartheid era in South Africa. And connect that experience with your thinking on Afro-pessimist thoughts. I'm very, as you might see from my questions, it's really kind of creating what are the linkages between your personal and intellectual life and kind of the evolution of those experiences towards this Afro-pessimist kind of discourse that you've been engaging in for quite some time. So I hope that makes sense, is to kind of situate those moments. And please then give us also a bit of a definition framework of what Afropessimism means to you.
Okay, so let me start at the end so I don't start rambling and get too far away from what you want. What Afropessimism, just like, Marxism and feminism, all these isms have many waves, so if you think the first wave of Marxism is Marx and Engels in 1869, and then the 20th century comes and revolutions come as a result of it. And then the thinking becomes adjusted. And I think that right now what we're in is the second wave of Afropessimism. No one knows that yet because the second wave books are in production by young people. So there'll be maybe 10 of them, which will take this definition even further. But basically, the pessimism should not be thought of as an emotional dispensation. This is where people get really hung up. It's not an emotional dispensation in its essence. It is borrowing from the work of the Italian communists and the theorists of hegemony and civil society, Antonio Gramsci, when he writes, I have a pessimism of the intellect and an optimism of the will, by which he means is that he's pessimistic of the intellectual production of bourgeois economists who reify and cathedralize capitalism, but he's optimistic about the will of the working class to go on strike and to foment revolution. So we have borrowed that same thing. It's a pessimism of the intellect, but it's a pessimism of the intellect of the intellectual production of two basic strains of left-wing thinking, which is Marxism and psychoanalysis, which we do not throw out with the bathwater. So we're not Pan-Africanists in the sense that everything the white man writes is a horrible thing and we're not going to have anything to do with it. We're saying Marx on one hand and Freud and Lacan on the other hand explains suffering in highly, highly sophisticated and vital ways. And we have learned from that, but they do not get to the essence of what it means to suffer as a slave as a Black person. That's number one. The second thing is that Blackness as slaveness is something that cannot be disimbricated. This is a highly controversial assertion, but it goes back to our borrowing on what slavery means, not from the empirical historians, but from Orlando Patterson's Slavery and Social Death, where he tries to define slavery as a relational dynamic, as opposed to report on slavery as a system of experiences and technologies of subjugation. I hope I'm going to gloss over a lot of that so I don't get into the weeds of all this. So basically, Afropessimism began by a group of intellectuals and activists in the Bay Area reading Saidiya Hartman, reading Hortense Spillers, reading David Marriott, and reading Orlando Patterson and rereading Frantz Fanon, and then looking and seeing that the left-wing political organizations that were involved in San Francisco and Oakland were not willing to inculcate what we call the grammar of suffering of Blackness into their organizational spaces. Just as practice, Black people are refugees in other people's struggle. But as theory, we're seeing the very same thing in which psychoanalysis and Marxism had no analysis of the paradigm of violence that Black people live in. And that's the most important for me in my work as an Afropessimist. That's the most important aspect of Afropessimism for me, that the violence that positions and elaborates Blackness cannot be analogized with the violence that positions and elaborates Native Americans, or the violence that positions and elaborates Palestinians, or the violence that positions and elaborates the working class. That anti-Black violence is its own beast, which we have heavily theorized as having no empirical utility. Violence against Black people is a necessary ensemble of rituals that helps the rest of the world be sane. And that's the end of the argument. So you wanted me to go, so that is it in a nutshell. It's an analysis of Black suffering, which shows how Black suffering is essential to the psychic orientation of the world, and B, cannot be analogized with the suffering of other oppressed people. It would take about 10 weeks to explain how all that works, but that's it in a nutshell. Now in Africa, I wasn't really there yet. I was a reluctant revolutionary, or accidental, if you might want to say that. My first wife had been fed so much garbage about how free things were in New York and how much things were better. She was a South African person, that when she lived in New York with me, she was mortified at what it meant, that what it, as she put it, what it felt like being Black in America was the same as what it felt like being Black in South Africa. And how could that be, since all of her law professors had said there's an essential difference between these two places? And so, as you know, or as many people know from reading my first book, she just left when we were going to move to Amsterdam, and I went there. And wherever I go, I become involved in struggle. And the ANC at that moment was an internationalist organization. She was in the African National Congress. I joined, and I moved up the ranks to be what would be like a political commissar of, say, the Democratic Party of all of the county of New York and Long Island, for example. Like one of the 5 political commissars for the African National Congress for the city of Johannesburg and the 16 surrounding townships. That's above ground. And I did a lot of other things. I worked on massacres. One was to document the massacres that the state and the Encounter Freedom Party were perpetrating against Black people in townships. And 2 was to create disinformation campaigns about the ways in which we were fighting against those massacres underground, because Amnesty Now and Human Rights Watch would not give any support to any groups that were fighting back as they were being genocided. So we were using the ANC's Peace Commission, which I was a member of, in addition to being an elected official, to smuggle guns and ammunition into squatter camps so that we could fight the Inkatha Freedom Party and the state. And 2, I was working in secret propaganda. And 3, I worked separately from all that in a cell of urban guerrillas who, in the daytime, were students at the university where I taught. And in the evening, so to speak, I was their cadre. Why don't I stop there and you can kind of direct me to how you'd like me to proceed at any time.
Sure. No, that's all very really fascinating thinking in terms of your own work in various places within the United States and in the diaspora, particularly South Africa. I was very much interested in the connections between your experience in South Africa, your personal growth and development as an undergraduate student, and then engaging with intellectuals on Afro-pessimist thought as a discourse. And so I appreciate the connections you've made and in defining for us this framework or the frameworks that have failed to capture in any substantive way anti-Black violence and the experiences of Black people in their own historical specificity, right? And how do you engage that in paradigms that have traditionally left Black people out, right, of those engagements? So I appreciate that discussion. I think what would be useful now is to engage. My question kind of goes back to Afro-pessimism, but thinking more broadly about what it means, because it means different things to different historical actors, whether we talk about continental Africans or people of African descent in the Caribbean and Latin and South American world, and then of course peoples in the United States. So Afro-pessimism connotes these divergent meanings for people in the global Black diaspora. And for continental Africans, over the past, you might say, sort of 30 or 40 years, it's been viewed, or I would say can be viewed, as a largely Western construct. Some might say a hegemonic kind of global North paradigm coined outside of the continent, and one that has been used by a range of individuals within the academy and beyond for assessing the challenges and the failures of post-colonial African nationhood. So I'm coming at it from an African historical perspective is what this question is kind of engaging with. Yet, of course, we know that it meaning Afro-pessimist thought, is part of this larger historical narrative of the idea of Africa as a continent plagued with many deficiencies, right? Which, of course,
I'm sorry,
so-called need.
Sorry, I will never do this again. But could I interrupt you for a minute?
Sure, go ahead, because it's a long. I wanted to give some context before asking the question. So,
and to begin with, I'm terribly, terribly sorry. Afro-pessimism was a lens of analysis for right-wing conservative journalists and what's called area studies scholars on university campuses. And it basically said that even though Africa has been liberated and their independence, that there's something innately insufficient inside of African governability that will never be up to Western standards. Like it's hopeless. And that is a sociological, right-wing sociological interpretation of politics and governance on the African continent. And it has a long tradition. Here's my problem. I had no idea of that tradition. I had no idea of those articles. I had no idea of those books. I had no idea of those scholars. I had no idea of those journalists. In 2002, when Saidiya Hartman and I were talking about anti-Black violence and how it affects the psyche of my South African students and Black American students. And she was speaking to me when she said, it's an interview in Kiparo that I did, where she says, I take a more Afro-pessimist view of this. And she was talking about the novel that I was talking about having taught, The Beautiful Ones Have Not Been Born.
By Ikwe Amar, right.
Yeah. And so the only reason I'm interrupting you is because if I could wave a magic wand, I would tell the world there's nothing relating Afropessimism of me, Jarrett Sexton, Hartman, and others, and what you're talking about. In fact, it's like we came out of a vacuum. I understand the confusion. I never heard of it before I used the term. So that's all I wanted to say.
Okay, no, thanks for the interjection, because I think that's exactly what I wanted you to engage with, is that there's this long tradition, mostly in the social sciences, you talk about in terms of politics and governance, but it's also taking a much wider connotation for assessing modern African nationhood and nation building. And so I wanted to ask you to kind of reconcile the group of scholars that you've been working with over the past 20 years who've engaged and who've kind of taken on that frame, Afropessimism, to talk about a different type of dynamic, right? That is in some ways specific to the Black experience in the United States, to people of African descent outside of Africa, in terms of the Atlantic slave trade and other slave trades in the Indian Ocean world and so on. And the anti-Black violence that was embedded in that process in terms of what it meant to forcibly remove African people and their bodies from the continent to other parts of the world. So I appreciate you kind of giving that backdrop, because that was really where I was getting at, is how do you reconcile that engagement, particularly such that we don't have a kind of US specific or a the sort of exceptionalism that can be tied to the way that Americans and African Americans sometimes engage with the global diaspora. I wanted to just hear your thoughts on that piece. But I want us to leave some time for questions. So we have maybe about 7 or 8 minutes to go back and forth, and then I believe we'll be opening it up. So I wanted to add another question that's related to the one about reconciling these varied meanings, whether in a disciplinary fashion or in sort of popular culture. And this question is about kind of what you might say the pushback or the undermining of this framework or discourse that we're calling Afropessimism, is that it has been and has continued to be undermined by the extraordinary efforts of a new generation of African and African diaspora peoples' contributions to the worlds of science, medicine, the humanities, film and the arts, technological innovation. And there's just, of course, a long list that I couldn't possibly note here, which all include kind of these generative projects of Afrofuturism, of Black futurity in multiple interdisciplinary fields that kind of pushes against this kind of, anti-Blackness and global Black violence, to say that actually Black people, whether we look at the diasporas, if we want to even use a small example of the Nigerian diaspora and what Nigerian people are doing broadly across the world, as one group of people with many, of course, historical connections, is to say that, can you comment on the dynamics of how these projects are undermining the kind of Afro-pessimist thought and global anti-Blackness that is so pervasive, obviously historically and in our contemporary moment? I hope that question makes sense, because it kind of is related to my earlier point, but I'll leave it there and see if you can hopefully make sense of it, and I can try to clarify if there's any confusion.
Well, in the interest of time, I'll say that I'm not sure where you are on your own question, but you and I might struggle in a seminar over the meaning of undermining. Sure. Because in other words, let me put it like this. Let's take it out of Blackness for a moment so that we make a kind of a paradigmatic analogy that people can relate to. There are some Marxists who would say that Cuba, the success of Cuba, Red China, bringing 1 billion people into literacy and giving them food and everything, and the Soviet Union, and the advances made, that undermines capitalism, that has undermined capitalism. And there will be others who would say that at a higher scale of abstraction, capitalism as a form of political economy still dominates the globe. In other words, to say that there's nowhere, even that the other group might say, recognizing the advances, the progressive advances in longevity of life, literacy, health, and just socialist governability that Cuba brings into the Western Hemisphere, this fact still remains that you cannot even be inside Cuba and be outside of a capitalist relation. Is that making sense so far? And so I would not poo-poo the advances of Black people, but I would also say that it's incumbent upon that interlocutor to prove to me through an argument, not through a sentimental assertion, but to prove to me through an argument that anti-Blackness is not the genome, the horticultural essence that organizes the entire psychic or libidinal economy of the world. So there's two things going on here. One, Afropessimism is not saying Black people don't make $1 billion. Black people don't produce science. Black people don't make advances in the academy. I'm very happy for all that. I just became Chancellor's professor. There's only 50 of them out of 3,000 on my campus. I'm happy about that. Happy for me. I don't think that advance is essentially instrumental in changing the framework of where Blackness is in the collective unconscious of the world. And that's where I would push back on the pushback, because I'm looking for someone to say to me, like in that Marxist scenario, for those people who are highly, highly celebrative of revolutionary moments in history, to say to me, has that undone capitalism? How is that undone capitalism? Or is that an inroad? And so I think you can say that in various parts of the world, the effect of anti-Blackness on the Black body is going to be different wherever you are. Yes. I don't think you can say there's somewhere in the world you can go where anti-Blackness does not organize the psychic reality of that entire civil society. I have written 3 books that argue what I've said. I'd like to see an argument, not a sentiment, to say that there's a paradigmatic shift based upon the advances of Black professionals. I don't buy it.
Right. So no, thank you for that. And I appreciate that. And I'll just qualify to say that I wasn't suggesting that advances in these, perhaps you could argue simplistic ways of sort of Black advancement, picking yourself from your bootstraps. That's not what I'm referring to. I'm talking about a generation of intellectuals and thinkers from continental Africa and elsewhere who are pushing against, again, a very sort of Western kind of framework. And by Western, the Western can also include Black intellectuals on the American side, right? Who, of course, there's the kind of what we might say the Pan-African embrace that has, ebbed and flowed over the course of the past 200 years. But my thinking is more to say that there's still in my view, and in the work that I see coming out of continental Africa, a generation of young people who are pushing against these paradigms in their thinking and in their writings and in their work, and just reframing some of this discourse. But I also agree with what you just said, that where can we look globally for actual systemic undermining of global capitalism and anti-Blackness, right? We cannot find a place where that has happened. So I agree with you totally. I just wanted to kind of play devil's advocate and say that there are people who are working and engaging in really substantive ways against these paradigms, including Afro-pessimist thought and discourse, that I think it's interesting. I think it's all, like you said, it's unfolding. There are the waves that you talked about. And yeah, it's left to be seen.
I would argue that it's probably, and you and I, we need another 2 or 3 hours to work out exactly we mean by this. But having lived in Africa for 5.5 years, I don't think the West is over here and Africa is over there. That's the first thing I would say. The second thing is Afro-pessimism is being asked to do too much. And it only does one thing. It explains structural suffering of people who are positioned as Black. That's all it explains. Just like half of Marxism only explains what it means to suffer as someone who must live off a wage. It does not explain what it means to suffer as a Mexican person in one's Mexican culture, as one suffers the wage exploitation. Or what does it mean to suffer as a Scandinavian person in one's Scandinavian culture? It only explains what it means to suffer as being the host of a parasite called the capitalist. And how that is manifest is going to be different culturally and geographically all over the world. I would argue that I'm going to just say categorically, as we're talking about hubris at low places here. I would just argue categorically that there is no pushback against this statement that Blackness suffers the same way all over the world.
Mm-hmm. Yes, no, I think that's a perfect way of kind of qualifying, exactly what it is that you're trying to get across and that you've argued elsewhere. So I appreciate those. I think it's a very important framework for understanding sort of the global experience of Black people, historically speaking, and in our contemporary era. So I think it's very useful and very important, even as I've tried to, engage with some other perspectives. So thank you so much for all of that. I appreciate it. So I think perhaps it might be nice now to open it up for some questions from the audience. And so I'll transition over to Kylie.
I could talk to you all day. This has been great.
Yes.
I would first like to thank both professors for this amazing discussion. It was very eye-opening, and I'm greatly interested in this very topic. But we will now be going to transition into the live questions part of this event, and the DPU is collecting questions that you have asked in a Q&A box. So if you have a question for Professor Wilderson, go ahead and type it into the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. And remember to upvote your favorite questions. Once again, if you wish to speak your question, put in your full name, or if you want to remain anonymous, select that option as you submit. And so our very first question is, how do you see the introduction of Christianity to Black life influencing the Black position within U.S. society? More so it is another mechanism of control, a provider of hope and unity, both or neither?
Well, I'm not a Christian, so it's gonna be. It's just historically accurate, right? That in 1525, the ecclesiastics of Salamanca met for a conference in Salamanca, and they were really pissed off at Christopher Columbus for cutting the hands off indigenous people in the islands and enslaving them. And so, from an Afro-pessimist perspective, the conference of ecclesiastics delegated by the Pope in 1525 in Salamanca is instructive in the sense that they were the first, or one of the first recorded pre-modern or modern theorists of anti-Blackness, in which what comes out of that, and you can see this in my second book, Red, White, and Black Cinema and the Structure of U.S. Antagonism. I'm basically riffing off of the work of Ronald Judy on this, but what comes out of that conference is this recalibration of the paradigmatic position of the Native American as being an irrational being. And so in that period, irrational beings were women and children. And so irrational beings had the capacity, according to these priests, to come into rationality with great discipline, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Back in 1853, Justice Taney says the very same thing in the Dred Scott decision. He says, the Indians are an inferior form of communal life, and I'm returning Dred Scott to slavery because he comes from something that is not communal life. He is an object of possession, and the lower courts were remiss not in their decisions, but in just hearing his case. He can never be a subject of jurisprudence. He cannot be a subject of jurisprudence because he is not a subject of human reality. And the ecclesiastics do this in 1525, saying, let's go to Africa because the Africans are non-rational, not irrational. And so what's important to me is that Christianity, and I would also say this about Islam, is incapable of recognizing and incorporating Blackness into its fold as spiritual interlocutors. Kylie, is that getting the question?
Yes. Yes.
So the same, it's about what the psyche does. The psyche looks at someone. And I don't mean taking Freud's early topography of preconscious, unconscious, and structural positionality. The preconscious of a liberal says, I love everybody. Everybody's a human being. Everybody's a citizen. But the unconscious categorizes just like that. And the unconscious always categorizes Blackness as other than a communal being. And some people are honest about it, meaning Dixiecrats, meaning Justice Taney, meaning the priests back in 1525. And some people are dishonest about it, like Joe Biden and Bill Clinton. But that doesn't matter. What it matters is that their unconscious understanding of Blackness as being outside of relationality is what constitutes all forms of communal discourse, whether it's Christianity, Islam, Judaism, or democratic politics.
Well, thank you very much for that response. I really never thought of it as that way, as someone also who is not Christian myself. But for this next question, where do you think Black social death begins? Through the Middle Passage, or is it at an earlier starting point?
Thank you very much for that. And this is where I was hinting, Naaborko, the new second wave of Afropessimism is just going to blow this whole thing up. The books that are being written by people who are recently graduated, by activists. There's a whole group of revolutionary people in the Black First, Land First movement in South Africa, for example, and in Venezuela, and in the land movement in Brazil. And I've even dealt with Black activists in the city of Vienna who are thinking Afropessimism through their own specificity. And one of the things that I have learned that is a corrective to my second book. My second book is Red, White, and Black Cinema and the Structure of U.S. Antagonisms, is that the Middle Passage is not the start. The Middle Passage is not the start. The start is in 625 AD with the Arabs vamping on what will one day become Tanganyika, what will one day become Uganda, what will one day become Kenya. And it's there in the literature of the Arabs, in the ways in which the Arabs use Black bodies as a kind of symbiosis to the development of Arab anthropological accoutrement. That's where it begins. That's where you can see the first glimmerings of anti-Blackness. When I say it's a kind of symbiosis, what I mean is here's this group of people on the other side of East Africa. They're not Arabs yet. They're becoming, okay? And as they become, rituals of marriage, family organization, proper ways of dealing intra-family sexual relations are developing. And none of that development could happen without the simultaneous destruction of Black bodies who are Black women who are being destroyed and captured to become the kind of points of attention for sexual desire that will become taboo for the Arab family, for Black boys who are being dragged from Kenya to the coast, having been leveled at the scrotum. What do I mean by that? I mean their penis, their testicles are all cut off, and the Arabs scrape their pelvic bone clean and then march them to the coast in coffles. And those that live cross over and become kind of guardians of harems. And in Arab literature, well, why is that? Why do they prefer that when they're also doing that to other people in their region? They prefer it because they fundamentally believe that the ugly faces of Black Africans will not be an inducement to women in the harem to be asked to be sexually satisfied, say through cunnilingus. This is written down. I'm not making this up. Okay, this is documented. I've had graduate students bring this evidence to me. So what am I saying there, Kylie? I'm saying that this idea, this kind of global consensus that Africa is a place of social death, that who we are as people needs to be elaborated over centuries in contradistinction to who they are as non-people. This does not start with the Middle Passage. The Arabs pass it on to the Portuguese. And that is a corrective to my second book.
Wow, thank you for that response, Professor Wilderson. Our next question actually will be asked by an audience member. So, Jared, would you like to ask your question?
Yes, hi. My name is Jared. I'm a 25, so I've only been on the Big Green for about a term or so, about a good 3 months. But I feel as if your words have truly resonated. You used the phrase, especially at the beginning of your of this conversation, in Dartmouth, not of it. Can you speak further on that? As I believe it resonates today for current students of the African diaspora here. It is more clandestine, yet still extremely applicable. What explicitly does that mean, and how did you experience that from 1974 to 1978?
Well, I've got a friend who is actually my editor. He's a big mucky muck at the Norton, big New York press, and he's a hotshot editor. I mean, last time on the National Book Awards, he edited 3 books in 2020, and all 3 of them were finalists, including mine for the National Book Award. He went to Yale. He was Yale class of '77. I was Dartmouth class of '78. We were comparing notes, and he says to me, he says, "Man, I don't know how you made it there, because in the Jewish community," which he's Jewish, you know, and he's gay, but he wasn't out there. He's in the Jewish community. We knew you don't go to Dartmouth, okay? You know, you can go to Yale, you go to Harvard, you go to Columbia, but you do not go to Dartmouth, okay? That's the most anti-Semitic place in the world, okay? So we have to understand. And you know, I'm not. Your name is Jared. For me, you scared me. I thought it was Jared Sexton who was going to ask me a really tough question, because he's one of the people for whom Afropessimism would not exist if he didn't exist. But you know, you have to understand, as Noam Chomsky has put it in his own work, what do these colleges do? What do they do? The Ivy League, Stanford, USC. What do they do? They produce the mandarins of a capitalist empire, okay? That's what they're about. It doesn't mean other things can't happen there, but it means that is the essential mission, okay? To produce the mandarins of a capitalist empire. And I remember back in 1981, so the direct answer to your question is that was really clear to me, because I had just come from a high school where everything was up for grabs. The word revolution was not used ironically amongst those teachers of mine who were in the new left, who were some of them were part of the University of Minnesota. My graduate students, others had just graduated. And so when I got to Dartmouth, it was as though nothing is up for grabs. In other words, what you're being, I thought I was being trained as opposed to being educated. Now, I'm not saying that there were other opportunities there, but I am saying that everyone seemed to know just where the line was and how not to step over that. I was used to going to anti-war demonstrations that sometimes became violence with my teachers. Very different at the high school. I mean, at Dartmouth. And so the next thing about it was that I felt that overtly or covertly, myself and most of the Black students there were chronically depressed. Chronically depressed. One person came back from an economics class. I'm sure, I hope this doesn't happen anymore. I believe it doesn't. And the person said, I know we just integrated 3 years ago, but I don't think Black students have the acumen to study economics. So for the three of you in this auditorium, please leave. There were all these things that would be called macroaggressions and microaggressions happening. In 1981, I was living in Chicago, and I was recruiting, and I got a message saying that, we're at a point in history where we need to get from the admissions people at Dartmouth. I don't know if it's in McNutt Hall or where it was, but they said, we need you to go to prep schools and recruit Black students. We don't need you going to the public schools anymore, because America's at a place now where we can get 10% Black students on campus who have been properly trained in the esprit de corps of an Ivy League institution at private schools, as opposed to those who come out of the public schools who come with a kind of attitude. I was like, what? So let's be real here. It's not that Dartmouth hasn't done anything for me. When I was a stockbroker and found people next to me using the phone book or buying lists and just dialing to get clients, I could get the Dartmouth alumni book out and just have some cat take me out to lunch and meet some people to get clients. Okay, that's the kind of high-end connectivity that Dartmouth can give you. On the other hand, I would say in those days, I don't want to say categorically in these days, it's a place for training academics, not for elaborating intellectuals. Jared, how are we doing?
I felt that was absolutely incredible. And to your point about chronic depression, I'm a member of the executive board member of the Afro-American Society currently. And when we have different meetings, there's still that pervasive sentiment that you have certain students that feel that way. And even in my courses presently, you still feel that subservience and that relegation to where you don't necessarily feel comfortable saying certain things out of, fear of retaliation from your professors, depending on who they might be. So there is still sort of that climate and, culture here that I feel as if it's potentially improved, but, it's a work in progress, if you will. So thank you for that.
I tell you something, if you can, and this is not my advice because it's very dangerous advice, live your depression externally, okay? Make some other mofo pay for it. You know what I'm saying? Now you read my books, you know that got me 2 years out my ass, right? I will tell you one thing. In 1976, we had almost a fist fight down in the basement of Cutter Hall because, I was chair of the Afro-American Society. I was like, this is the 200th celebration of the American dream. It is the 200th year of the American Revolution. We got to blow up the spot here, And half the people said to me, I came here to get a GS-17 job. I didn't come here to be no goddamn revolutionary, And the other half were like, let's do it, So we really, really, it was already then in 1976 seeing the conflict. And what we did, those of us who I won't go through the whole thing because it's a long, drawn out intra-Black war that happened in the AM, in the basement of Cutter Hall. But ultimately, we got Bose 901 speakers and long ass cords and strung them out from the AM all the way past Keywood Computer Center, where they had these big tents where the alumni were all coming back to celebrate 200 years of the American Revolution. And as soon as they all got set up with their tea parties and everything, we blasted James Brown's The Big Payback until the campus police shut us down. So as Frantz Fanon says, On page 100 of Black Skin, White Mask, he's talking psychoanalytically, but he's also talking politically. If I see in my analyson, my patient on the couch, if I see the neurotic symptoms of hallucinatory whitening or lactification, that sense in the unconscious that says, which is what we have at Dartmouth College, that I must turn white or disappear, I will not help my patient better himself or help herself see what's wrong with herself. I will help my patient turn her or his anxiety outward against the social structures. And I think that's what saved my sanity.
Right.
But
thank you for that.
It didn't help me in the long run, because what I'm saying, Jared, is there's a price to be paid for sanity.
This is true. This is true.
Well, thank you, Professor Wilderson, for that response. And also thank you, Jared, for that question. Even though it is 7:01, we will still be continuing with a few more questions. And this next question is also going to be asked live by Jeremy. So Jeremy, would you like to ask your question?
Yeah, sorry, one sec. Yes. Yeah, my question is, so Fanon and the Wretched of the Earth shows how colonial subjects, especially in Algeria, were only seen as treated or sane when they accepted the outlook of the colonizer, their French colonial colonizers. Foucault also traces how modern psychiatric regimes have medicalized psychological differences and confined madness to prisons and psych wards. I've especially seen this at Dartmouth, where the people with significant neurotypical differences, especially people of color, are treated very badly and have been confined against their will in psych wards. So non-neurotypical Black people especially are faced with extraordinary prejudice. What are your thoughts on this topic? And especially, do you think that Afropessimism has common cause with anti-psychiatry?
Do you mean the anti-psychiatry of Deleuze-Guattari, or the anti-psychiatry of Fanon in colonial wars and mental disorders? Which do you mean?
I think closer to Fanon's anti-psychiatry.
Yeah, well, I think it's right on. I mean, I think that's where we get a lot of our sustenance. And if you want more on this, the specific psychoanalytic reading of that is in, I'm very embarrassed to say I don't remember what chapter of my book, but I will refer it here. Chapter 2 of Red, White, and Black, called the Narcissistic Slave, where I stage a debate between Lacan and Fanon, in specifically in the ways that you're talking about, and I think, without going too much off on a tangent, the most important thing here is not that the psychoanalytic gift of a theory of the unconscious needs to be thrown out with the bathwater. I think it's highly productive. I think what is important and what Fanon helps us understand, even though, remember, Fanon dies at the age of 36. He doesn't fully understand what he's given us. But one of the things that is in both Black Skin, White Mask and the last part of The Wretched of the Earth, where I assume you're talking about the case studies that he's done on people who are under psychiatric care, is to show how psychoanalysis as a non-Black white discourse has not thought through the psychic trauma of someone who receives and is positioned by a violence that has no utility. In other words, David Marriott has written about this in his psychoanalytic book On Black Men. The violence of lynching is not a form of lawless, discriminatory violence. It is a ritual of renewal and psychic regeneration for the lynchers. And once we understand that, then we can broaden our conception of violence in the way that you're talking about to containment. And we can think of these places where we're supposed to get educated as very violent as well and psychologically traumatizing. Is that helpful?
Yes, that's very helpful. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Jeremy, for your question. This next question is from an anonymous attendee. Do you believe that Afropessimism would exist do you believe that Afropessimism would exist without capitalism, without the introduction of a capitalistic system?
Yes, I do. And I did not at one point, but as I said before, when thinking about, there are people called Bugandans, Maasai, Kikuyu, okay, and they're that before the year 1000. You know, Bantu, the Bantu migration that took place in a zigzag for a long period of time, but they're not Black. Just like right now, if you go into a factory in Milan or in Paris, you will find workers, members of the working class. But if you go back 400 years to their ancestors, you will not find members of the working class. So what I'm trying to say is that Blackness and the sense of Africa is inextricably bound with what I said earlier, this Arab need to develop anthropological accoutrement, to develop what it means to be family, develop what it means to be Arab society, and this is a pre-capitalist intervention because capitalism is only about 400 years old. So we're talking about 1,300 years ago in a pre-capitalist world where anti-Blackness begins to become elaborated as a kind of mechanism through which the binal economy, which is, say, the collective unconscious of all sorts of other people, can develop. And that's the sad truth about it. Now, capitalism does something to that, right? It industrializes that psychic need in horrifying ways, in ways that the Arabs didn't do. But unfortunately, I will say this to you, to the speaker also. I was shocked. I'm not shocked anymore. I was shocked in 1973 when I was 17 and spent a little over 2 weeks in the Soviet Union to engage, to see performed for me at a bar outside of Red Square the intense anti-Blackness of people who at that point were Soviets. And I was, who at the same time pouring $400 million worth of arms and logistical assistance into the guerrilla movement of the African National Congress. Yeah, anti-Blackness is more essential to the psychic orientation of the world than capitalism.
Wow, really thank you for that response, Professor Wilderson. This next question by Justice, one of our attendees, will also be asked live. So Justice, would you like to ask your question?
Yes, can you guys hear me?
Yes.
Thank you. I want to say, I'm super nervous because I'm a big fan. I read your book, Red, White, and Black. Got me very much into theory. So I'd like to start off by saying good evening. And you stated earlier that you were ready for a revolution rather than reform. So I wanted to ask, how would you create a revolution large enough to create a paradigm shift of thought? Or at least, do you believe that a small revolutions can be invoked in spaces that create inevitably a paradigm shift? And how would Black people be able to accomplish this within spaces that they occupy?
What's your name again?
Justice.
Justice. I'm joking with you. Is it, did I pronounce it right, Justice?
Yes, it's Justice. Thank you.
Because it was my dissertation, and the first faculty that I formed for that were so against it. And I had no idea that this word that Saidiya Hartman gave us, which, as I said before, I had no idea was related to we were just trying to argue with the assumptive logic of our professors and the organizing people around us at the time. But the real answer to your question is that the real answer to your question is seditious. You understand, Justice, talk to me now. Are you hear what I'm saying?
Yes, I'm hearing what you're saying.
And I've been to jail a number of times and don't want to go back. Okay. So let me put it to you like this. Why anti-Blackness is so essential is because if you get back to the Arabs and get back to Justice Taney and Donald Trump and Hillary Clinton, right? And all the things that she said about Black gangsters and everything like that, you can see how much the psyche, the global psyche, needs Blackness as a foil against which it defines itself. Can we talk a bit, Justice? Do you understand what I'm saying there, so I can move on?
Yes, you can definitely move on. I have you.
So what I'm trying to say is that anti-Blackness is more necessary to what sustains humanity than is capitalism, than is homophobia which sustains the heteronormative family. Anti-Blackness is anyone can fall, but they can't fall into Blackness. That's what we mean by taking Fanon's words from Black Skin, White Mask, the end of the world. Because once anti-Blackness doesn't exist, then we're on the cusp, not of a crisis, but of a catastrophe, which would be, it would be a epistemological shift, an epistemological shift into a world that cannot be thought of in the way that a non-capitalist world can be thought of. I'm not saying it can't happen. It can happen. It should happen. We're struggling to make it happen. But I don't believe that anyone can write a sentence about what that looks like on the other side in the way that one can write a sentence about what does it look like on the other side of the heteronormative family. What does it look like on the other side of capitalism? Because that's how essential being against Blackness is to all spaces that are communal. That's one thing. Now, what can we do about that? Well, Afropessimism offers nothing, absolutely nothing, not because it's recalcitrant, but because thinking the unthought, if I were to think the unthought, then I would be cutting off a piece of the problem just to make you and me feel better, Justice. You see what I'm saying?
Yes, I understand.
However, as I said before, where do we get the pessimism from? Pessimism of the intellect, optimism of the will. And we fundamentally are crazy celebratory about the energy, the affect, the intellectual production, and the mode of resistance that Black mass movements can have. There's absolutely no movement in this world that hasn't actually been parasitic on the ideas produced by Black resistance change people. Everyone has picked from us, and no one actually wants to be with us. That's how important we are. We need to take ourselves seriously because we are the center of the world. And that's not a compliment. That's not a great thing. We are the center of everyone's anxiety. That's why we have to take ourselves seriously. So I think that the first thing that we have to understand is that where we are, even though, as I said, it goes back to 625 AD, is not where we have to always be. It was constructed, but it cannot be destructed simply by legislation or community policing or getting more people who are Black into Dartmouth College. Okay, you need to be able to think in a way that Dartmouth is pressing upon you not to think. And so what we did is to form reading groups. That's the one thing you can do that probably won't get you arrested. Okay, and you may be doing that already. Read theory. Read as much as you can. become as expert at theoretical interventions so that your brain can live at the highest level of abstraction, so that you can, when I read Das Kapital, the first 500 pages, I walked into Macy's, I no longer saw clothing. I saw blood dripping from the hangers. Develop an X-ray vision of relational dynamics, and that will shift your brain from a reformist orientation to a revolutionary orientation, and then wait for the opportunities.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. I really do appreciate it. All right, I'm going to stop fangirling now.
Thank you, Justice, for your question. And as much as I would love to continue this discussion and Q&A for another hour, unfortunately, we cannot. And so this will be our last question of the night. It is from an anonymous attendee. How do you think reactions towards Afropessimism differ from Black intellectuals living and raised in the West, particularly in the United States, to non-Western Black intellectuals?
I think that Afropessimism, we kind of touched upon this earlier. Repeat the question for me so I don't just go off on my own pluck.
Sure. How do you think reactions towards Afropessimism differ from Black intellectuals living and raised in the West, particularly in the United States, to non-Western Black intellectuals?
Okay, if you go to South Africa and you bring up the top of Afropessimism amongst Black scholars, you're probably going to get a lot of aggro, okay? But those are intellectuals, but they're also intellectuals in Kylie, in Soweto. And so one of the interesting things about this is that Afropessimism is being read and translated by large numbers of people in what now is the Anti-African National Congress grassroots organizations in the townships. It's being read by various kinds of intellectuals in Lagos, in Venezuela, in Brazil, in Vienna. These are places that I've been in and had these engagements. Okay, so the first thing you want to do is say that there's no one way in which non-Black American intellectuals are engaging Afropessimism. Some are engaging, in ways that are highly, highly generative, and others are saying this is no good for us. Okay, that's the first thing. The next thing is that you want to be a bit of a Gramscian, going back to Gramsci's prison notebooks, when you think about intellectuals. And organic intellectuals are intellectuals who are elaborated by revolutionary movements, and traditional intellectuals are intellectuals that are elaborated by the academy. They're both intellectuals. And my experience is that people, I don't know of any Black resistance organizations or any Black resistance communities of intellectuals in Brazil, places I'm familiar with, in Venezuela, in South Africa, who are saying this is of no use to us. When I went to South Africa in 1989, there were two types of contraband. One was guns and ammunition, and we hid those in what we call DLBs, dead letter boxes, which were hidden all over the country. The other was intellectual work, and those were hidden in like behind the professors. If she had a wall behind her, there'd be like a false wall in some places in Soweto, and then lots of books. Over 70% of those books came from the Black Power movement in the United States. So what I'm trying to say is that there's a diasporic conversation going on between Black people who are struggling against the state, and Afropessimism is being welcomed in that conversation. There's another diasporic conversation going on between Black people in the academy, and that's a little more dicey. But it's also dicey right here, okay? Because one of the things that Afropessimism says is that the word human, like it's a basic tenet of semiotics, that words are not indexical of things. When I say to my students, define a table for me, and they go like this, wrong. That's putting conceptual signifiers in direct relation with phenomena. So if I were to say, let's table this discussion, and you threw this at me, it would show to me that you had some kind of psychic obstacle which did not allow you to cross the bar of metaphor. So in other words, what I'm trying to say is that Afropessimism hurts, and the way it hurts gets elaborated through what I would call a symptomatic rejection rather than an intellectual engagement. It hurts to read an analysis that humanity exists over here and Blackness exists over there. And that to be human there's no such thing, blood, flesh, that's not what it means to be human. Human, just like table, is a concept that is created. And concepts are created semiologically in contradistinction to other concepts. The word CAT has no organic meaning. Cat has no organic meaning. It can only develop conceptually in the brain if it has a conceptual opposite, which is DOG. And so HUMAN, human, cannot possibly be a universal moniker for all sentient beings. Just like Arab developed as a conceptual set of anthropological accoutrement through the destruction of this entity called Black. That's how it became into being, not through any internal organic autodidactic development. That's how things get meaning. And what hurts is the sense that to be human is to occupy an extremely violent position in the world through which you know yourself in contradistinction to the violence that you and your kind do against Black people. That hurts humans, and it hurts Black people who have tried to call themselves human all the time. I'm not saying it doesn't hurt. It hurts me, okay? It hurts me. But that hurt has led to, I would call, a schism of sentiment inside the Black Academy that has nothing to do with analysis. So I did two things in my answer. I made sure that we didn't think of intellectual just as people who have degrees and books, but think of intellectuals as people who organize the concepts of revolution and resistance on the ground. And the second thing was to say that Black intellectuals in the diaspora, in the Caribbean and in Africa, are similar in their sentimental refusal of Afropessimism as Black intellectuals inside of the Academy of the United States. But it is sentimental. I do understand it. And hopefully in the next 10 years, we'll move beyond that to an analysis where we don't have to value being human and understand it as the murderous embodiment that it is.
Wow, I honestly wish we can continue this conversation forever. I have so many questions, but unfortunately, I believe that is all the time that we have today. I first want to thank the people who asked questions, as well as thank Professor Sackeyfio-Lenoch for moderating this event, as well as Professor Frank Wilderson once again for joining us this evening and continuing this conversation for an extra 24 minutes. I also want to thank the DPU Executive Council and ambassadors for their amazing work in putting this event together. And finally, I want to thank everyone and all of you who attended this event and asked questions. If you are interested in learning more about the DPU, check us out at thedpu.org or on our Facebook, Twitter, or Instagram pages. Our handle is the DP Union. Although all DPU events are free and open to the public, if you'd like to support the DPU's mission to bridge the partisan divide at Dartmouth with a donation, please reach out to us at dartmouth.political.union@dartmouth.edu. Thank you all once again and have a great evening.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you.